In our headlines at this hour, President Yoon and his US counterpart Joe Biden will hold their first summit talks on the afternoon of May 21st at the new presidential office in Yongsan. Meanwhile, the White House has warned of possible North Korean provocation either prior to or during Mr. Biden's trip to Asia, which begins on Friday and ends next Tuesday. Back on the local front, campaigning for the June 1st local and parliamentary by-elections has kicked off on this Thursday, with pundits claiming the capital region will be a major battleground. Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report for Thursday afternoon, May 19th here in South Korea. I'm Min Sun-hee. President Yoon and his US counterpart Joe Biden will engage in a 90-minute summit Saturday afternoon following Mr. Biden's arrival here in South Korea on Friday. Our Kim Da-mi has more on the agenda ahead.
After arriving late Friday afternoon, U.S. President Joe Biden will kick off his first visit to South Korea in the form of an official visit. His bilateral summit with South Korean President Yoon is slated for Saturday at the new presidential office in Yongsan between 1:30 and 2 p.m. Korea time, following Mr. Biden's visit to the Seoul National Cemetery to pay tribute to the fallen heroes. Seoul's top office says the two leaders will sit down for their first bilateral for roughly 90 minutes, during which the two sides are expected to discuss issues ranging from Korean Peninsula affairs, economic security and cooperation, as well as global challenges.
We anticipate the summit will include new South Korea-U.S. alliance in the realm of technology. We will promote close policy and information coordination based on common values and mutual benefits.
The summit will then lead to a 50-minute joint press conference by the two presidents, which will be followed by a Q&A session from the press. Later in the evening, President Yoon will host a dinner banquet for his U.S. counterpart at the National Museum of Korea, with about 50 people from various fields ranging from heads of conglomerates to key figures in culture and sports from the Korean side and 30 from the American side. In fact, sources say the first thing on Mr. Biden's itinerary in South Korea is a tour of his Samsung Electronics semiconductor plant in Pyeongtaek upon arrival on Friday, the first such a visit by a U.S. president. Speculation is running high that President Yoon may accompany President Biden in this tour, as the two allies place much gravity on beefing up economic security cooperation. Although the fine details of Biden's Seoul visit are not immediately known for security reasons, the presidential office noted that the two leaders will see each other at least once to take part in an event together for all 3 days of Mr. Biden's stay in South Korea. U.S. President Biden will leave for Japan, the second leg of his Northeast Asia tour, early Sunday afternoon for a 3-day visit there. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
And North Korea may stage further shows of military might within the next few days, that is, to roughly coincide with US President Joe Biden's agenda here in this part of the world. Now, this is according to White House officials who add they are fully prepared for possible provocation. Our Kim Hyo-san reports.
The White House warns that there could be a North Korean nuclear test or missile test, or both, before or even during President Biden's trip to Japan and South Korea. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters Wednesday that Washington is preparing for all contingencies.
And we are prepared, obviously, to make both short and longer-term adjustments to our military posture as necessary to ensure that we are providing both defense and deterrence to our allies in the region, and that we're responding to any North Korean provocations.
He explained that the U.S. is coordinating closely with Seoul and Tokyo. Sullivan also added that he spoke with his Chinese counterpart over the phone Wednesday to discuss the matter. According to the White House, the two parties mainly focus on regional security issues and non-proliferation. Regarding the matter, the first deputy chief of the Presidential National Security Office of South Korea, Kim Tae-hyo, told reporters on Wednesday that the possibility of North Korea conducting a nuclear test by this weekend is relatively low, but preparations for an ICBM launch are believed to be imminent. A South Korean expert said the North is preparing for a nuclear test, but this might not be carried out right away.
The cables are installed to light up the tunnel or to operate ventilation systems. When the cables are removed and a shield is installed, that's when it's ready for a nuclear test. But for now, because the cables are still there, we can tell that the preparations are still underway.
Against his backdrop, Seoul adds that if there's a provocation from the North during Biden's visit, there is a plan B, which would secure the readiness posture of the combined U.S. and South Korea military forces, even if it requires changing the summit schedule. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
Top defense officials of South Korea and the U.S. held talks over the phone for the first time on Wednesday to address North Korea's blatant violations of international law by rampantly testing its weapons technology. Defense Minister Lee Jong-seop and his U.S. counterpart Lloyd Austin also touched upon ways to maintain a strong defense posture through combined efforts, including joint military drills. Minister Lee, for his part, also highlighted the importance of deploying U.S. strategic assets to the Korean peninsula. And over in North Korea, its state-run media says the total number of fever cases in the country now stands at almost 2 million. Authorities there, however, have yet to respond to South Korea's Office of Medical Support. Our Min Soo-kyun has more.
North Korea has reported one additional death and over 260,000 new fever cases. The figures were from 6 p.m. Tuesday to 6 p.m. Wednesday. The North state-run Korean Central News Agency said that the total number of cases is now nearing 2 million. It's been just a week since Pyongyang confirmed its first COVID-19 infection after claiming to be virus-free for over 2 years. The rapidly spreading virus is raising concern that a major outbreak could have devastating consequences in North Korea.
The situation appears to be very severe, so all we have right now is North Korean data. And we have to work with that data. There appears to be a fairly severe outbreak in the capital city of Pyongyang at about 269,000 active cases. That's 7.5% of the population of Pyongyang.
The fact that there's been no public vaccination program put in place is another alarming concern.
Unfortunately, for the people of North Korea, vaccines are not available the same way that they're available in most places in the world, and that's the biggest weapon in the fight against COVID.
Earlier, South Korea reached out to offer medical assistance to the north, but the regime has remained silent for the 4th day. On Monday, Seoul had sought to deliver a fax message through their liaison office about holding working-level talks to provide medical aid such as vaccines, masks, and test kits. But the north did not respond to the message. Many experts say that it won't be easy for Pyongyang to accept the offer, since the last thing North Korean leader Kim Jong-un wants is a help from South Korea. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
Campaigning for the June 1st local and parliamentary by-elections has begun on this Thursday. The country's two major parties are hoping to gain majority in the 17 metropolitan mayoral and gubernatorial elections. The ruling Conservative People Power Party is looking to extend its success witnessed during the March presidential race, while the main opposition Democratic Party is aiming for a comeback to keep the central government in check. A major battleground is the capital region in Incheon and Gyeonggi Province. Now, that's where major parliamentary by-elections are taking place, with former presidential candidates Lee Jae-myung and An Cheol-soo on the ballots. U.S. stocks lost ground on Wednesday amid rampant fears of a recession. In fact, the Dow Jones Industrial Average saw its worst performance in almost 2 years, falling over 1,164 points or 3.5%. The S&P 500 also plunged 4%, trading at 3,923 points. The Nasdaq, meanwhile, dropped 4.7%, its second worst decline this year. Major U.S. retailer Target saw shares tumble about 25%, largely due to higher fuel and freight costs. Now, shares in its rival Walmart also retreated on Tuesday and Wednesday. Some 700 Ukrainian troops have reportedly put down their weapons at the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol over the past 24 hours. Now, this is according to Russia's defense ministry on Wednesday, raising the total number of soldiers who have surrendered from the steelworks to 959. The figure contradicts Ukraine's number of 250, and Ukrainian officials have yet to comment on this contradiction. Meanwhile, the Russian defense ministry adds the last of Ukraine's forces leaders remain in the plant, refusing to give in. Also in Europe, Sweden and Finland have taken a tangible step into joining NATO by handing in formal applications on Wednesday. Our Kim Yongsan has more on their move from neutral to NATO.
Sweden and Finland have handed in their formal applications to join NATO. On Wednesday morning local time, the two countries' envoys delivered their applications to NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg.
The applications you have made today are an historic step. Allies will now consider the next steps on their path to NATO.
The two Nordic countries have been neutral for decades, but they've changed their stance because of the threat to European security posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Public opinion in both countries have swung heavily in favor now of breaking with neutrality and fortifying Europe's defenses.
It's a message of strength and a clear signal that we stand united going into the future ahead.
If both countries are admitted, it would mark the biggest NATO expansion in decades, increasing its membership to 32 countries. Finland's border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers long, would be the longest single land border between Russia and the NATO allies. The process of joining NATO can take up to a year because of the need for ratification by all 30 of NATO's existing members. But Sweden and Finland could face more obstacles, with Turkey recently expressing a reluctance to admit them due to what it says is their refusal to deal with Kurdish militants. But Secretary General Stoltenberg made clear on Wednesday that NATO will move to resolve all outstanding issues and reach a conclusion quickly. Kim Yongsan, Arirang News.
In other news, Japan's nuclear reactor regulator, that is, has granted an initial approval for the release of treated radioactive water from the Fukushima plant into the sea. The Nuclear Regulation Authority gave the green light on Wednesday, claiming there are no safety concerns. The plan would have TEPCO filter the contaminated water, leaving only the radioactive element tritium. It will then dilute the water until the tritium levels, that is, fall to less than 1/40th of regulatory limits before releasing it into the ocean. Last year, Tokyo announced intentions to discharge over 1 million tons of Fukushima water starting around spring of the year 2023. Seoul, in response, vowed to closely monitor the plan with the IAEA. A new study published in a Lancet journal shows pollution kills some 9 million people annually worldwide. Our issue has more on this tragic reality.
An estimated 9 million people die each year as a result of pollution, and the risk of toxic lead poisoning is also increasing. That's according to a study of global mortality and pollution levels published in the Lancet Planetary Health Journal on Tuesday. According to data analysis by scientists, air pollution along with urbanization drove a 7% increase in pollution-related deaths from 2015 to 2019. Chemical pollution also increased, with lead poisoning alone causing 900,000 deaths a year. A death toll of roughly 9 million per year means pollution is behind 1 out of every 6 deaths worldwide. That's on par with smoking in terms of cause of deaths. In comparison, COVID-19 has killed about 6.7 million people around the world so far. The cost of death to the global economy amounts to some $4.6 trillion per year. The study found that the impact of pollution on global health remains much greater than that of war, terrorism, malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, drugs, and alcohol. The study also looked at specific causes of pollution. It separated traditional contaminants such as indoor smoke or sewage from modern pollutants like heavy metals, agrochemicals, and fossil fuel emissions. According to the study, while deaths from traditional pollutants are declining globally, they still remain a major threat in Africa and other developing countries.
As you might expect, the worst impacted are, of course, low and middle income countries and vulnerable communities. So the high income countries, US, Europe, we're seeing a lot of progress in those countries. And conversely, with low and middle income countries, we're seeing the deaths really rise in those countries.
Some of the countries most affected by pollution-related deaths based on findings adjusted for population were Chad, Central African Republic, and Niger. Meanwhile, deaths caused by modern pollutants rose 66% since 2000. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of part 1. In part 2 of the Daily Report, we delve into the regional and global pandemic situation. Stay with us.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean New Day. Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Welcome back. It's time now for Viewpoint, and today we assess the pandemic situation here and elsewhere amid conflicting strategies and situations among countries. For more, I have Professor Howard Lee from Seoul National University. Professor Lee, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me today.
I also have Professor David Kwok from Sooncheng University. Professor Kwok, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
Professor Lee, since it's been a while, maybe we could start with you with an assessment perhaps of Korea's current COVID-19 situation.
It looks like the worst has passed. For example, the daily new case of infection per population has decreased to approximately 8% of the peak time, which was several weeks ago. However, it's too early to let go and get relieved. For instance, the ICU admission per population, which reflects the severity of the COVID-19 cases, is still relatively higher than that in other countries. So we have to be careful about that.
Right, we have to be more vigilant then. And Professor Kwok, given the current status quo then, with regard to our COVID-19 situation, what do you suppose would be wise with regard to quarantine guidelines for COVID-19 patients here in the country?
Well, so I think what you're asking is whether or not we should actually lift the quarantine measures that we're currently mandating for everyone who are infected. Well, you're asking a clinical physician. So in my personal view, I am the most conservative person in approach to really dealing with any kind of infections. especially when it comes to a disease that can cause death. Quarantine, I think, should still remain mandated, especially when we're facing, in the near future, possibly considering changing the test for people who are entering the country from having been tested through PCR tests. Now, most likely to be changed to antigen test. That being possibly creating more chances for false negatives. People who are actually infected, not screened through the process, could enter more easily. I think will be affected by what happens globally much more easily in the near future as well. So if we start to, let's say, lift up the quarantine mandates altogether, at the same time we're opening more to the global community, it is more possible that we'll be much heavily affected by those neighboring countries or any other countries that would still be affected by resurgences. And those resurgences will not necessarily come from the original strains of COVID-19 that we've had before, but those will happen from newly appearing subvariants, such as the BA4, such as the BA5, and possibly even more new subvariants as well. And we do not know currently whether or not those could also cause severe cases. What we're mainly concerned with is that through the past huge wave, we've noticed that the severity and the death rate significantly reduced compared to the prior waves. And I'm hoping dearly that it'll stay that way. But if we were to be faced with, let's say, sadly, a severe causing new variants, but we're completely open to it and where everybody's exposed because they're not mandated to quarantine, will obviously be in a much more dangerous situation, not just for the individuals who are infected, but also population-wise, epidemiologically speaking. So I think it's still too premature to really talk about completely lifting up the mandates for quarantine. I think we should keep the bare minimal distancing guidelines that we can, but still have the economy going as we can. We're having going through with mandating of lifting of the mandates for the masking on the outside and etc.
Right. So a 7-day quarantine for COVID-19 patients here in the country.
I hope so.
Professor Lee, starting Monday, Pfizer's Paxlovid is being offered to teenagers and adults with pre-existing health conditions here in the country. What are your thoughts on this expanded use of Paxlovid?
I want to see that as a positive sign because it simply reflects the drug has been more available right now in South Korea compared with early this year. So that's a good sign. But also I want to focus on the use of Paxlovid in teenagers and children. As you said, starting May 16, teenagers ages 12 and up can get Paxlovid if they have underlying diseases such as cardiovascular diseases, chronic lung diseases, and diabetes. And this measure is not totally unexpected because the emergency use authorization conditioned by the MFDS, the regulatory agency in South Korea for Paxlovid, says that it can be prescribed to children ages 12 and up. Actually, this age group has not been tested in the original clinical trial with Paxlovid, but Pfizer, the developer of Paxlovid, embarked on a new clinical trial in children and teenagers ages 6 to 17 to study the efficacy and safety of Paxlovid in that age group. Of course, we're still waiting to see the results, but putting all the data available with regard to the exposure to Paxlovid, it looks like the systemic exposure to Paxlovid in teenagers and children is much more similar to that in adults. So having said that, I think Paxlovid can be safely used to curb the symptoms of COVID-19 in children.
Right, who have pre-existing conditions, of course. Professor Kwak, starting next Monday, as you mentioned earlier, negative rapid antigen tests will be accepted when choosing to enter South Korea. What are your thoughts on this ease in border restrictions?
Well, I'm sort of ambivalent towards the changes in the measure. Number one, PCR tests would obviously provide provide much stricter screening capability from us, blocking out any, even the slightest chance of a person who's infected to enter the country. So it'll, in a sense of direction, it'll directly protect us from having a person who's infected to come into the country better compared to having them being screened through the antigen test, let's say. But on the other hand, antigen test provides much fluency, meaning people who need to enter could possibly be tested through. And currently we know through the Omicron variant, it doesn't necessarily cause severe cases of disease, let alone much less mortality as well. So I think at this stage, antigen tests, having people entering the country being screened through antigen test would suffice. But I want to limit it to the time being because, as I've said before, in such cases where a new variant starts to cause higher severity and also higher mortality, that would be the time period where we would probably need to go back to a much stricter screening process to directly protect us from having any exposure to someone who's infected to come into the country. Now, comparing antigen test and the PCR test is like the 99.99% accuracy test. Antigen test, on the other hand, creates a lot of false negatives. But at this point, as I said, because it is the current most common variant is not known to cause any severe, well, not any, but relatively speaking, less severe diseases and also less mortality. We are currently saying that, we may let this go a little bit and sort of take into consideration that there would be few cases where people are exposed to those who are infected entering the country. But as I said, once it starts going back to possibly causing more severity, then we should probably go back to PCR testing as well.
Right, and then tighten our border restrictions then. Professor Lee, moving on to the vaccination front, there is quite a bit of talk about the efficacy of second booster doses. Where do you stand on this debate?
Well, I strongly support second booster injection, particularly for those who are over 50 and got their first booster at least 4 months ago. And also immune-compromised individuals, irrespective of their age, are also strong candidates for second booster. Cumulative evidence has shown that vaccine efficacy against COVID-19 and its related hospitalization is waning within 2 to 5 months after a first booster dose, especially for the Omicron variant. Not only that, emerging evidence also suggests that a second booster dose of a messenger RNA vaccine can improve protection against severe COVID-19, and that is not associated with any new safety concerns. So again, I think the second dose shot is a must.
Right. And now, Professor Kwak, let's address the pandemic situation beyond national borders. As my colleague Min Soo-kyun mentioned earlier, North Korea is witnessing that is an explosive outbreak of fever cases, which is suspected to be COVID-19, but has yet to be confirmed because of their testing capacity. Do you share this outlook that the situation over in North Korea may spiral out of control?
Well, I actually personally think that it is already out of control. They're lacking the vaccines up front, and then they're also lacking any sort of medications to treat the patients. To the best of my knowledge, they're also lacking symptomatic medicines as well. So they're importing those what are necessary from overseas, except, I guess, those countries that they are against. So the situation is already quite dire, and it's quite worrisome. The most thing I'm quite worried about is the fact that most of the population that are going through the pandemic now haven't been vaccinated. So this Omicron variant is not currently well known on how much of the severity it can cause to people who are naively infected, meaning those people who have not been exposed to COVID-19 even distantly before and also have not been vaccinated. So we have to watch very closely what it caused there. But I think as a brother country, as a cousin country, I think we should prepare also to help them if they need through whatever process that we can support them to save lives, really, because these are not political people who are being affected. Those are regular citizens, and regular people, just like us, who are possibly dying from the disease. So I think we need to also prepare for possible help we can. If we can lay our hand to them.
Right. Well, we have extended, we have talked about intentions to help them, but they have yet to respond to our support. But they have reached out to China and Russia. Now, North Korea, Professor Lee, reportedly is rejecting vaccine support and instead calling for treatment. How do you explain this stance?
Well, I think there are several possible explanations. First, the North Korean regime appears to think allowing vaccines to be introduced in North Korea is a sign to let foreign countries dominate over the regime itself, which can be a threat to the wholeness and sovereignty of the nation. Second, there is no infrastructure at all, such as cold chain logistics for vaccination. So even though the vaccines are available, there is no way that can embark on a nationwide vaccination program in North Korea currently. Thirdly, I think since the Omicron variant has been rampant in North Korea already, there are so many people who need to be hospitalized. So in that case, they need treatments instead of vaccination. So I think all those things collectively facilitate North Korea to ask for treatments instead of vaccines.
Right. And elsewhere, Professor Kwak, South Africa, that is noting a dramatic rise in case counts, especially among people who have immunity against the virus through a natural infection or vaccination. How worried should we be about this reality?
So when I looked into the matter, it seemed like South Africa, among many other countries who are going through another resurgence in their countries, are mainly having subvariants of BA4 and BA5 constitute the newly occurring infections. And currently being studied as up to date, it is known to be able to sort of evade the prior immunity people might have gotten either through vaccination or through prior infections. And that's what's worrying a lot of medical personnel all over the world. But another thing that I also noticed is the fact that those countries currently being said to be affected by these variants are namely two countries, Portugal and South Africa, did go through prior waves of their pandemic about 5 to 6 months before. And many other countries have their own peaks of waves about sometime in between of those time and now, meaning other countries that are not currently having as big of a resurgence did have their own waves, let's say 2 to 3 months back. In our own case, we had our peak of the wave about a couple months back also. So I personally hope and predict that we won't be heavily affected by these variants. But scientifically speaking, currently being studied the BA4 and BA5 being able to evade prior immunizations, there is still possibility it will be able to affect the global community, let alone the Korea, in the near future. So we should keep a close eye on it, but we should also possibly think about how we could immunize ourselves against even further occurring subvariants as well.
Right. And Professor Lee, neighboring China remains committed to its zero COVID policy despite the global health body's doubts about its sustainability. What are your thoughts on this?
Not only WHO, the World Health Organization, many, including myself, are very doubtful about the effect of the so-called zero COVID policies strictly implemented in China. China is the world's biggest country, and I don't simply understand how this gigantic country could 100% prevent COVID-19 from being transmitted from one area to another by simply locking down the whole cities and regions. Besides, some of those zero COVID policies are inhumane and sometimes unethical. No civilized country sustained that kind of zero COVID policies forever, and China is not an exception.
Right, I see. And Professor Kwak, back here in the country, with regard to COVID-19 strategies then, the Yoon administration has spoken about having a COVID-19 strategy that is based on science. Now, that being said then, Professor Kwak, what scientific basis would be crucial to allow for the lifting of face masks indoors?
There will be a I guess there would need to be a huge scientific background to actually start allowing people to not wear a mask inside. Number one, obviously, there needs to be a scientific proof that people will not be infected despite taking off their mask indoors. There also needs to be strong proofs that taking off the mask indoors will not cause more severe and more deaths than before when we were wearing masks. So in that regard, in retrospectively speaking, I don't think there's a great chance that we would start to lift the mandates for wearing the mask indoors at least for the time being, and not just in the near future, because what we're currently seeing is that through wearing the mask indoors at least, we're not only protecting ourselves from getting infected with COVID-19, but also with many other diseases as well. And it's quite beneficial for especially respiratory infected diseases. So I think, sadly speaking, we're going to see wearing the mask indoors at least for a little more while.
Right, I see. And Professor Lee, do you believe Korea is poised to mark a resurgence, which is something that Professor Kwak touched upon earlier? And if we do have a resurgence in the near future, Professor Lee, do you suppose it would be severe or mild?
Well, looking back, the previous several waves of COVID-19, and I think Korea will enter a resurgence sooner or later. To me, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Professor Kwak already mentioned about the newly found variants, BA4 and 5. And then those variants have been identified in South Africa mostly. And these variants are slightly more transmissible than the Omicron variant. Additionally, these new variants can dodge some of the immune protection conferred by previous infection and vaccination. So I think it will come again. I don't know it will exactly, but it can be soon. And the severity at this point, I don't have any crystal ball, but I hope and pray that it's going to be lesser than we underwent.
We hope so too, of course. Professor Kwak, when do you suppose, this is going to be a really tough question, that's a multi-million-dollar question, when do you suppose will this pandemic end?
Well, as we have seen through prior waves, we started noticing that more and more resurgence occur, less severe and less mortality it starts to cause. And we're already currently seeing around us that people are living their lives as if we are prior pandemic. So I think, officially speaking, I don't think the word pandemic will possibly ever go away. We can't really title ourselves to be over the pandemic at any time soon. But realistically speaking, in the real world, we are already having sort of our foot inside the door to the post-pandemic era, where we consider COVID-19 to be not as the severe disease that we used to have before, but more like a common flu type of a deal, where we could possibly get infected and get away with it, or possibly we could protect ourselves from it by being injected with immunizations and whatnot.
Right.
So I'm thinking pandemic, not in the title, but in the realistic sense, I think is already in the progress of getting eradicated.
Right, okay, I see. All right, Professor, thank you so much for your thoughts today. And Professor Lee, thank you as well for your insights. The lifting of outdoor mask requirements appears to be having a favorable impact on sales for cosmetics companies as many return to their makeup routines. Arirang has this coverage.
A new word appeared in conversations in South Korea during pandemic. The word magikun, meaning mask fraud, refers to the difference between a person's looks with and without a mask. The word even made it to the Guardian newspaper in relation to masks being able to hide the unfortunate parts of people's faces.
I've heard the word magikun before. It's that confusion you get when you see a colleague with their mask off and find them unfamiliar.
One of my colleagues who had interviewed someone for a job said he didn't recognize the new employee because he looked different with his mask off.
But with the recent lifting of the outdoor mask mandate, this mask fraud phenomenon more likely to become a thing of the past. Instead, some people are refocusing on their beauty with makeup.
I'm wearing a new type of makeup which highlights the eyes. Before the pandemic, people wore full makeup as all of their faces could be seen. But since the outbreak of COVID-19, makeup trends have been shifting.
And now the lifting of the outdoor mask mandate will lead to another change in makeup trends.
Wearing masks made people focus more on their eyes, so the demand for cosmetics like mascara and eyeliner soared during the pandemic. But now with people taking off their masks, makeup based on a personal color to boost the best parts of their faces is gaining attention.
Sales of cosmetics are seeing a rapid rise. Data released by major department stores show that sales of cosmetic products at Lotte department stores increased 20%, with Hyundai and Shinsegae each seeing 25% increases in April compared to the same period last year. The government's lifting of social gathering limits and mask mandates has largely driven the sales rise. Some e-commerce platforms are also trying to expand beauty-related sectors. One e-commerce platform is running an online beauty class where consumers can learn makeup tips and get recommendations for cosmetic products.
During the pandemic, testing cosmetic products was not allowed at offline stores. So we decided to open a live beauty class where show hosts could try out and review new products while answering viewers' questions regarding the product.
She added, with the weather becoming hotter and outdoor activities without mask wearing increasing, sales of cosmetics like sunscreen, lip products, and perfumes are expected to rise. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Over in the southwestern city of Gwangju, commemorations to mark the city's May 18th pro-democracy movement this past Wednesday was also joined by bereaved family members of those who lost their lives in the wake of the sad events that took place in the year 1980. My colleague Kim Do-yeon met up with a few of them to take a look.
70-year-old Kim Sa-ik and 65-year-old Yang Jung-gan both lost younger brothers during the May 18 pro-democracy movement military crackdowns. On this 42nd anniversary, they're here at Gwangju May 18 National Cemetery, where their brothers were laid to rest.
I was scared, so I was kind of in the back. Now my brother is dead and I am forever ashamed. I have been ashamed to be alive for the past 42 years.
Until now, conservative politicians had been accused of showing less compassion for the deceased and their relatives. That's why President Yoon Suk-yeol's decision to sing along to the Marching for Our Beloved, while also calling on his party's lawmakers to come down with him, is all the more significant.
However the conservatives were before, the fact that he said Gwangju led the foundation for the whole country's democracy was good. I didn't support Yoon. In fact, I opposed him. But what he did today has a lot of meaning.
Yang is not the only one that opposed President Yoon. The city as a whole has never voted for a conservative president in the history of South Korea's direct elections since 1987. In fact, Yoon just had 12% of the votes in Gwangju during the last election, and that was a record high for a conservative candidate. Hence, some remain skeptical.
The Conservatives have to repent. They didn't have to come to Gwangju today.
On the other hand, his speech certainly underscored the importance of the historical event, but the citizens of Gwangju and relatives of the victims want more tangible action.
Maybe soon the May 18 pro-democracy movement can be added to the country's constitution. That would lift a lot of weight off of the deceased relatives.
This, hopefully, can be a constant reminder to South Koreans about the dark history. But for the citizens of Gwangju, it's never forgotten. At the city center where civilians held their ground until their deaths, the memories are preserved. From bullet holes to daily alarms at 5:18 p.m. that plays the Marching for Our Beloved melody. Behind me are nearly 250 bullet holes from the last days of the military crackdown on the May 18 pro-democracy movement. The country spent decades just to come to a consensus that these holes are caused by helicopter gunshots. The sooner more of these truths come out, the sooner families of the victims can find peace. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News, Gwangju.
And staying in Gwangju, a concert was held in the city also on Wednesday to mark its past pro-democracy efforts. On stage were songs based on poems by Yoon Dong-ju, a South Korean poet who wrote during Japan's occupation of Korea. Here's Lee Seung-jae.
May 18th is a day of remembrance for South Koreans. For several days from that date in 1980, hundreds of civilians in the city were killed, while thousands were wounded in a crackdown against pro-democracy protesters by the authoritarian government. Considered a pivotal moment in South Korea's struggle for democracy, nearly 250,000 people participated in the movement. May 18th is now a national day of commemoration, and victims of the violence that occurred on that day are honored as contributors to the country's democracy. To salute May 18th, a public music concert was held on Wednesday in Gwangju City. Under the theme of Singing for the Pain of Gwangju, music based on the poetry of Yoon Dong-ju's was composed and showcased. One of the nation's most beloved poets, well known for his lyrical compositions and resistance against Japan's colonial occupation of Korea, Yoon is regarded as a bard of purity, youth, and patriotism. Including The Sky, the Wind, The Stars, and the Poem, an all-time favorite of Koreans. 19 poetries written by Yoon have turned into music, and among them, 12 pieces were played in the concert. A beautiful melody played by the piano and flute was accompanied by soprano, mezzo-soprano, tenor, and baritone singers. Tenor Song Tae-wang says holding the concert at the Cheonil building was very meaningful.
This is like combining the spirit of resistance that the poet Yoon had during the Japanese occupation of Korea and that of Gwangju's citizens during 1980.
The Cheonil building is seen as an iconic symbol of the May 18th pro-democracy movement, which was on fire when residents took up arms against government forces. The building has now been transformed into a civic cultural area. Lee Se-jong, who composed the music, says visiting the birthplace of Chung Byung-wook, who was Yoon's classmate, gave him the idea for composing the melodies.
Yoon's drafts of 19 poems are well stored in Chung Byung-wook's birthplace in Jeollanam-do province. I was greatly impressed by seeing them in Jung's birthplace and decided to compose music from the poems.
Also saying that people should remember the spirit of the poet Yoon, Lee added Gwangju's pain, which resembles Yoon's spirit, should never be distorted. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Official figures released on Wednesday show that UK inflation has soared to a 40-year high of 9% in April, as food and energy prices have skyrocketed. This comes as month-on-month consumer prices rose by 2.5%, while a Reuters Economist poll has projected a 9.1% annual increase. The rise beats the previous 8.4% annual rise record from 1992. From April 1st, the UK's energy regulator increased the household energy price cap by 54% amid a surge in wholesale energy prices. This, in addition to the Bank of England hiking interest rates from 0.1% to 1%. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the country's interior ministry announced the results of the 2022 parliamentary elections on Tuesday. According to figures, Hezbollah and its allies lost their majority in parliament, securing only 59 seats, down from 71 in the previous elections in 2018. 65 seats are needed to secure a majority in the 128-seat assembly. The results also highlighted unprecedented gains by 15 reformist candidates, reflecting public anger at the nation's financial and economic collapse. The Interior Ministry added that the voter turnout stood at 42%, down from 49% in the previous elections. On Wednesday, an ink drawing of a nude man by Michelangelo sold for more than $24 million at an auction in Paris, according to the Christie auction house. The sale breaks a previous record for a drawing by the artist when the Risen Christ was purchased for $9.9 million. Designated a French national treasure, the work was barred from export from France for 30 months. However, the French government recently removed the ruling, allowing the drawing to be offered without restriction to global collectors. The pen and brown ink sketch is titled A Nude Man and Two Figures Behind and is thought to be one of Michelangelo's early works, dating to the end of the 15th century. Now, a robot has been trained to taste food at different stages of the chewing process to check if it is salty enough. According to researchers from Cambridge University, the robot may help in automated food preparation. Already trained to make omelets, the robot tasted 9 separate dishes of scrambled eggs and tomatoes. To do this, researchers attached a probe that acts as a saltiness sensor to a robot arm. It was then able to generate taste maps of different dishes in just a few seconds. Researchers hope that by doing this, robots will be able to experience the difference in the taste of food as it's chewed and improve its ability to taste. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Thursday afternoon. We're seeing a quite similar pattern to yesterday, with unusually high temperatures reaching the upper 20s in most regions and Gyeongju, topping off at 30 degrees. The calendar says it's May, but the weather is behaving like it's mid-July. And even after a strong wind advisory was lifted, the risk of wildfire remains very high. Well, yesterday's showers gave some temporary relief, but not enough to ease the low humidity. Dry weather advisories are still in place in many regions, so please be extra careful not to cause a fire. Even if it's looking murkier now, the UV index is still very high in many regions. Also factor in high ozone levels, and air will be dusty all day long in and around the Seoul metropolitan area, so it's not a great idea to stay outside for a long time if you live there. Well, temperatures look to be on the rise with a few outbreaks of rain in the forecast, and Seoul is expected to hit nearly 30 degrees in the next week. Now, let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
And that brings us to the end of the Daily Report for this Thursday. Do join us again tomorrow. Thank you for now.